Welcome to Dusty Little Wastelanders, written by L.L. Smith, narrated by L.L. Smith. Chapter 1, Dust to Dust. Dust. It painted the shanties we passed and packed the dirt paths our boots trotted on. It blew with the wind and stuck in your throat like that stubborn old goat that just won't. It was all nature threw our way for most of my 17 years, I'd reckon. Daddy asked for food, money, or shelter, but got dust instead. Mama wanted everything for Kyle and me, education, manners, a reason to smile, but got dust instead. It had been at least a few good years since our last storm. We knew it was fixing to come. Miss Nature never missed a chance to spoil our foul existence with some more dust. Mama had been gone for what didn't feel like too long ago, but as I lean on this bar counting the years, my 7 fingers made the years feel as long as they are. I passed my eyes back to my brother and Kyle's pale, splotchy mug, blonde hair stragglers with a spitting image of her. I sometimes saw her reflection in his matching hazel eyes. She'd always said that Kyle and I were 2 years apart. Assuming my assumptions about my own age is accurate, that would put Kyle at 15. I've shared all my memories with him. Heck, he was around even before I could remember stuff. The years have gotten harder to count as we wander on, but if I had to guess at it, I'd say Daddy died about 4 years ago. I at least know it was 3 years after Mama. Daddy was real adamant about having a calendar and keeping track of time. Dust got in their lungs and took them both. After Mama, I kinda reckon Daddy more or less let it take him. His boys were full-grown adults, plenty ready to fend for themselves, and his true love had left him, so he followed her down that path. I can still see him clear as day in my memories. That familiar visual, his deeply tanned skin, tall gangly figure, and dark chocolate waves of hair that matched his eyes. Hell, take 17 years off him, plop a white curly-brimmed hat on his head, and you're looking at me. Kyle and I had been wandering since the day Daddy passed. Wasn't anything for us in our hometown. Stonetooth's what they called it. And the shanty we lived in blew apart every dust NATO anyway. Dust NATOs were commonplace in Stonetooth. We got 4 a year on a slow year. Our shanty was more a wind chime than a housing structure. We were the only family we had and didn't rightfully mind it that way neither. Kyle and I have been traveling from town to town for years now, looking for work and moving along once the market dries out. And the market's always dried out. "Get back to work, Donald!" our boss barked. I looked up from the bar into the thick of the tables. They were splintered, sorry pieces of wood nailed together to form tables and chairs. Haggard drunks filled most of the available seating. Shady salesmen, clumsy repairmen, and hideous harlots. These were the ever-revered members of Mootown's working class. The same people who'd turned their noses up to wastelanders like Kyle and me. Wastelanding was far from easy, but we had our freedom. Donald's frumpy self sagged the chair legs beneath him. His bald spot screamed from the sea of people. Poor old goat was losing hair like a chicken loses eggs. He had that familiar slithering smile plastered on his cracking lips. He was sowing some sexy lies with one of the chunkier harlots. The bar hands ain't supposed to talk to the patrons. Donald wouldn't be getting paid today. He was raised on the beliefs of that great Hickafoo, or whatever his name is. His wiry whiskers were evidence enough of that, but I couldn't help but wonder whether incessant flirting was one of the founding pillars of that belief systems too. We'd picked up Donald a couple towns back. Kyle and I were working in a mine. It was dang dirty work. 3 months in there, and the mine had a major collapse. We scrambled like hell out of that mine. One of the support beams collapsed onto Kyle, pinning his legs down. Alone, I could only do so much to help us out of that fallen death pit. Lucky for us, Donald noticed our struggle and turned back to help. If not for his efforts, we both would have collapsed in that mine. Kyle and I were skipping town after all that, but were stopped by a crowd gathering outside the local brothel. Turns out Donald got himself in some sort of trouble inside. Well, we owed him a favor. So we snuck our way around the back to help find a way out for Donald. We distracted the crowd long enough for Donald to sneak out the back window. With our favor repaid, we snuck out of town and headed to the next job. We'd heard Moontown was a place to be, except we were accompanied by Donald. We were even, and I didn't want the company. But Kyle seemed all too thrilled by it, so I conceded. We've been in Moontown now for the past 2.5 months or so. There ain't much work in this town, leaving Kyle and me to bartend night after night. Moontown was a major drinking town, famous for booze and nothing else. The other Wastelanders had promised work in Moontown. I suppose bartending is work, just not the work neither of us had in mind. It was, after all, one of the unspoken rules of wastelanding. Bars will always have work for Wastelanders. This was in part because Wastelanders made up most of the bar's profits. It was also customary for a Wastelander to leave the bar after a couple of days' work, opening the job for the next guy. To support the claims of our predecessors, there were plenty of bars here, which in turn meant that there was plenty of work for Wastelanders. But Kyle and I were wanting something a little more permanent. We'd worked most bars in Moontown, and this circuit'd be drying soon. I could just about feel it at this point. We need to be looking at our next stop, and soon. "What are you thinking, idiot?" Our boss slapped Donald right on his bald spot as he walked to the bar. "Bar hands aren't to be talking to the patrons in this bar." She started a conversation with me, Donald rubbed the back of his head. She's a harlot, our boss spat. She talks anything with a dick. I hope you realize you're getting paid now. Come on, boss, Donald begged. I gave you 8 good hours today. You barely gave me 6. The boss reached into his tip jar beneath the bar. He slapped a 20 in front of Kyle and another in front of me. I snatched another regular day's pays off the counter, pulled Betty off my head and turned her upside down, stuffed the payment into her brim and put it back on my crown. The boss slapped 14 bills in front of Donald. Thank you, sir. Donald clasped his partial payment. Yeah, the boss groaned. Now get out of here, the lot of you. The boss's hairy forearm guided us to the exit. We snatched our belongings, which still lay by the door, then stepped out the back exit and into the alley. The backs of the shanties lined either side of the alley, heading deep east and west. Bars, inns, food suppliers, knick-knack shops, and so much more lined these alleys. The alleys were a crummy place to spend our nights, but they were free. Beggars came by more often than I cared to count. I assumed they'd learned to stop asking a bunch of poor wastelanders for handouts, took every penny to keep myself clothed and fed, which didn't leave much room for lazy bones. But I'm always quickly reminded as to why they come back around whenever I see Kyle give $1 to our frequent vagabonds. Was he somehow more frugal than I? These donations occurred on every working day, and Kyle never ran out of food, money, or goodwill. I didn't get it. We pressed through the alley looking for an unused spot to set up camp. We hadn't trucked too far from the bar before running into a familiar obstacle. There in the alley stood our newest fan. A young boy had been trailing us for the past 3 nights. He and Kyle were already fast friends. He was a strange child, his skin tanned red and his brown hair messier than a plate of goulash, and he seemed unable to speak. These meetings were becoming routine, and it was time I addressed it. Kyle had already won over the favor of Donald, and this child seemed to be next. Although I didn't object, I didn't intend to make a habit out of adopting more extra baggage. But the baggage this young boy carried outweighed the 3 of us tenfold. Can't he travel with us? Kyle begged. I was surprised I hadn't heard this one on the first night. No, I retorted. He's just a kid, Kyle scolded. We can't leave him alone. With all the recent abductions, he's bound to get nabbed. He's a kid, I confirmed. And kids can't work. The last thing we need is another mouth to feed that ain't adding any money to the pot. And you should keep your nose free of the Moontown's event pages. All them stories of abductions are probably just runaways. We're stone-toothed runaways. We were probably reported as abducted in their news boards. Donald can barely work between flirting fits, and you keep him. Kyle stepped in my face. I don't keep Donald around by choice, I asserted. He's here because you insisted upon letting him come along. We aren't adopting anyone else, Kyle. Hey! A man shouted from behind me. I turned to face him and his army of scowling goons. They're taking our meal ticket! They shouted and began to close in. Instincts kicked in. Kyle swooped up the kid while Donald and I led the way. We kicked up a dust trail, turning down every other alley and diving in and out of bars. We were young and slick and lost our pursuers quicker than a snake bite. Once I was comfortable with the distance we'd created, I'd signaled for a stop. During our time bartending, we'd grown familiar with all these back alleys. We'd worked most of the bars in the circuit anywho. Despite all that, we still wound up behind one of the 3 bars in town we hadn't tended for, the Musty Tavern. It was aptly named and was host mostly to convicts, a place I wasn't too keen on bringing Kyle to, but with our pursuers and any familiar territory behind us, our choices were scarce. We slipped into an alley and entered the Musty Tavern from the rear. Seedy faces were fixed on us winded youngsters who had just entered the bar from the exit. We played it cool with smiles, but our cover was blown upon entrance. The tables had been cleared to either side of the room as the Moontown drunks redefined happy hour. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, just another hastily thrown together shack of a bar-in combo. After working so many, all these dives felt the same. Fancy light sockets were strung through the ceiling, but I knew this place didn't have no electricity. Probably no bulbs neither. The oil lamps that sat on every service were evidence enough that they couldn't use them fancy sockets. Most places had torn them out entirely. We worked through the droves of drunks, stumbled dancing to sporadic piano mashing. Kyle and his young friend cruised through this scene with much amusement on their faces. Donald's eyes darted this way and that, probably looking for the drunkest woman in the crowd. I was headed for the stairs. I thought about blending in with the crowd, but should our hungry hunters show up, there'd be no place for us to run.
Hey there, what's up? LL Smith here. Thank you so much for enjoying my audiobook. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and say, if you get real anxious to hear what happens next and just can't wait till next week, or if you get the urge to just support such a stunning, ruggedly handsome, and awesome independent creator such as myself, I encourage you highly to go follow the link in the description and support the official release. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right back into that story.
I had to keep my eyes over my shoulder to make sure Kyle and the kid didn't get lost in their laughter, and to be sure Donald didn't make any moves. I led my team up to the bar's 2nd floor. There were fewer prying eyes up there, as most drunks were afraid of heights. Kyle and his friend giggled up behind me, and a distracted Donald took up the rear. We settled in the back half of the bar nearest the room's ends. Kyle offloaded his little buddy. It was time for me to get some answers. I approached the kid with the friendliest smile and a mind full of whys. I'm Enry, I introduced myself. It's like Henry, but without the H. That's what I tell people. The little one gave that a giggle. That old fellow behind me is Donald. We picked him up a couple towns back. He's probably 30-something, old as dust, but harmless anyway. And that man whose hand you're holding is my own baby brother Kyle. He's so smitten on you I'd watch out for a kiss. I smirked with a wink, and the kid giggled back. All right then, I started. What did you do to piss those men off? I asked. He reached into his vest pocket and retrieved a ragged old blue handkerchief. It was folded real nice and tied in a bow. His grimy fingers undid the bow and revealed a treasure of 2 cornbread muffins within that worn fabric. 2 cornbread muffins? I dismissed his concerns with a wave. Why, we should have enough cornbread muffins to give those guys. I looked back to the little guy. He was shaking his head quite rapidly. No? He made that answer very clear. He pointed to the muffin and then to himself. I was baffled, and I imagined my face told him that well enough. He pointed back to the muffin and bit a chunk out of it. He pointed back to himself and proceeded to bite a chunk out of himself. It took me a second, but I had a hunch. They wanted to eat you? I asked. He nodded. Well, we can't let that happen. I stood straight and leaned against the wall. I wasn't thrilled about adopting this darn kid, but I couldn't rightfully leave him here to a bunch of cannibals neither. I reckon I'd known from the get-go that I'd be caving in to Kyle on this one. I at least wanted to make him work for it. My hands were forced, and it was time to play them out. Well, if you're going to be coming along, we need to be able to call you something. What's your name, little one? I asked. He pointed to his heart, where a little kindergarten name tag was stuck up against his brown vest. Funny to think the people still went to school these days. Stonetooth had quit teaching school while Kyle was still in kindergarten. Never realized the end of schooling wasn't a wasteland and wide thing. The dust had faded out most of the letters on the kid's name tag except for T and M. Well, alright then, I decided. We'll call you little TM. He smiled. That was a new one. I suspect Kyle had been waiting for this conversation. He grinned the whole time. He knew I was mellow when he showed that smile. Couldn't help but stare at it, kind of soak it all in. Man, how it reminded me of Mom. I couldn't stomach the feelings to tell him that, and I didn't reckon I ever will. But I never tired of having that feeling back in my life, a feeling uniquely tied to my brother. We have a whole crew now, Enry, Kyle exclaimed. Sure do, but I wish we could shake this geezer, I scoffed. Oh, shut up, Donald replied. How are we getting out of this town, Kyle? I hollered over to my brother. Why can't we just reason with them? He asked. They're trying to eat a child, Kyle. There's no reasoning with them folk, I shot back. We've run into some cuckoo characters while wastelanding, but I never thought we'd actually run into cannibals. Kyle sunk back into himself and reached into his pants pocket. He opened it up and spread it onto the nearest table. The crinkled outline of Moontown was detailed in ink on this map. Just another collection of beat-down shanties. Every town's map was beginning to blend into each other. Good thing I never had to worry about reading them. I haven't the slightest where Kyle found this, but he's always been resourceful like that. We gathered around to hear the plan we already knew he'd concocted. Little TM was too small to see at the top of the table, and Kyle hoisted him into a chair so he could get to the meeting. So we're here, Kyle stated, pointing at our location on the map. The least paved path out of town will send us right into the heart of the crime syndicate. No one's hungry enough to follow us there, but once there, it's out of the frying pan and into the fire for us. We'll have to stick to the outer roads on our way out of town, which will turn a day's walk into a 3 days walk. Kyle detailed his plans with his index finger darting all over the paper. Sounds like a plan, I asked. It'll have to be, Donald said, pointing to the bar's floor. Our pursuers had entered the bar and were now speaking with the bar's owners. Let's get! I led my squad to the nearest door, ran my shoulder into it, and broke it wide open. I had to check my eyes as I just barged in on 2 women doing things too freaky for any 17-year-old to see. Kyle and Little TM were the next in the room, and they were even faster past the skeptical than I. Of course, Donald had to stop and chat. You ladies need a third, he offered. Donald was flipped 3 fingers, and he flashed them back an ass cheek. Get your pants on and get in here, I flagged Donald down over the window. I hoisted Little TM out the window and onto the roof first. I followed him through, then came Kyle, followed by Donald, who was still gawking at the ladies. There wasn't space enough on the roof's awning for 4 people, as the elbows in each other's sides soon pointed out. I took the lead off the awning and fell further than I'd realized, but still stuck the landing. Come on, Little TM, I'll catch you. I motioned for the little man to jump into my arms. He was scared pale. Of course, Kyle scooped him up and leapt with him in his arms. Kyle's landing wasn't near as graceful as my own. He landed and fell with a thud right onto his back. He'd at least managed to protect Little TM from the impact. Kyle tried to play it cool, standing back up and dusting himself off. The focus was soon back on Donald, who still had his face stuck halfway in the window. Donald, get down here, I scolded between gritted teeth. Donald turned his focus onto us and leapt from the roof back down to us. His landing was pretty clean, too. There they are, our pursuers shouted with a point as they exited the bar. Dang it, Donald, you took too long. TM hopped on Kyle's back and we were hoofing and huffing it through town. Any sense of a plan had fled my mind, but Kyle's backseat running kept us on track. "Turn left here," he'd shout, and I'd oblige. Calls of left, right, keep straight filled the air as we steered south. We'd long since lost track of the guys from the bar, but we pressed on. I wanted to create as much distance between them and us before we were gassed out. I think Kyle was hoping to get us to the bad part of town before stopping, but we came short of that goal. A couple clicks back, I'd noticed Kyle's shouts becoming less prominent. I turned over my shoulder to spot him, but he was trailing at a snail's pace. I motioned for us to stop and let him catch up. "We can keep going," Kyle insisted between pants. "I don't think we need to," I said. "But you definitely don't need to keep going with TM on your back. You sound like you just got done being strangled." TM left off Kyle's back, and Kyle crashed to the ground with his back against the nearest shanty. "For real, guys," Kyle said. "Once we get down south, we need to stay low," he stressed to us. "This is serious. People get sold to labor camps on an hourly basis down there." "I heard the sex trafficking market down there is pretty booming." Donald danced his fingers through the air while Kyle cringed. "I'd be fine with that. Hook me up with some hot senorita and I'll be all good," Donald continued. "Stop it, Donald," Kyle scolded. "This isn't a joking matter." "Cool it, everybody," I stepped in. "We're going to be in and out of that place in no time. No labor camps and no sex trafficking. In and out." The boys fussed a bit with curled lips, but my words kept them in silence. We set up camp for the night in that cozy back alley. Kyle gave a sleeping bag to TM, and I gave my sleeping bag to Kyle. We'd need to get that boy a sleeping bag in the morning. I came up to Kyle and TM to relinquish my sleeping bag, but TM seemed to be fussing about something. His bottom lip curled like a noodle, and his mumbles were like little darts of anger. I wasn't much for tolerating tantrums, especially from random strays. "What's wrong with him?" I asked. "I'm not sure," Kyle said, "but don't worry, I've got this." Kyle knelt beside TM with a confident smile. "Hey, TM." Kyle got his troubled attention. "What did the cannibal say to his wife?" I didn't like where this joke was going. "I could just eat you up," Kyle punchlined. TM gazed at Kyle with an unamused face. He'd at least stop making that ear-torturing whining sound, which was all I cared about. I left them to each other and their bad jokes. I cracked open a can of beans, pulled my spoon from my bag, blew off the dust, and dug into my dinner. We'd be running into the desert soon, so I had to be conserving water, only washing down when the beans were too dry to swallow. I hadn't paid much attention to the food Kyle or Donald had gotten the last time we brought provisions, but I stuck with beans. They were cheap and filling. Kyle usually stuck with vegetables, as he had the diet of a rabbit, and Donald typically loaded up on potatoes, mashed. It was a large culprit of his growing gut. I watched Kyle and TM stargaze themselves to sleep that night. A sense of wonder in both their eyes was like Mama's chicken noodle soup slurping down my gullet. It was good for Kyle to be in the company of like-minded persons. I sometimes feared that my pessimistic ways might actually change him, and TM had taken a liking to Kyle right off the bat. That Kyle really had a knack for picking up strays, a habit I wasn't fully a fan of. Donald kept pretty mellow since we picked him up, but just like Dustinado's, I felt like it was only a matter of time before his urges got us into more trouble. But I tried not to focus on that. Could only take things a day at a time out here. Living as wastelanders like we did, we were liable to just get killed in our sleep and never see morning. A lesser man might feel the need to assign a night watch, but we were used to sleeping light. End of chapter 1.